Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. Today I have a great project, and that is forging the fearsome knife of the Gurkha warrior, the Kukri. For this project I'm going to be using a brand new piece of 5160 steel. Of course, 5160 is well known and renowned even for its ability to make a very tough blade. As a spring steel, which is the original purpose for 5160, the toughness aspect is the most important thing, but it does have an appropriate level of carbon to provide good edge holding capabilities when combined with proper edge geometry. And since this Kukri is going to be a large chopping knife for various applications in the field, you want something that's going to hold up well to a lot of heavy use and even abuse if necessary. The bar is 1/4 by 2 inches. And most knives I forge from something more like 1.5 inches by 1/4, or even 1.25 inches by 1/4. But the extra stock is going to be important here for this size of blade. The first step is to simply taper the stock, and that's much easier done on a power hammer or a press even than by hand, although of course it can be done by hand with a little bit more time and effort. 5160 steel is a bit stiffer to forge than your 1080 or 1095 because of the 0.8% chromium content that it has. I provided myself a counter bend so that when I begin to forge the bevel, the blade will begin to spread back the right direction. However, keep in mind that this Kukri is going to have a bend or crook to the final shape, and so I put in a little bit more counter bend than I normally would have. I've never forged a Kukri before, so I'm not entirely sure if this is the right amount or not, but we'll figure it out as we go. The next step is to forge the width down on the rest of the stock because the handle is quite a bit narrower than 2 inches, as is most of the blade towards the handle. I want to provide a decent swell or bell at the end of the handle. This is going to help the user retain their grip, as the weight of the blade would essentially pull it out of your hand as you're chopping or slashing, and we don't want to lose our tool as we're using it here. Of course, in the context of battle, the Kukri could also be used as a stabbing tool, but what I'm forging today is a bushcraft or field tool, and so making sure that your hand doesn't slip up onto the blade really is not an issue in this particular case. And in fact, the traditional Kukri didn't really have a provision for preventing that anyway, so I'm assuming that the proper use, even in the context of battle, didn't require that. So we have some counter bend, as you see, towards the tip of the blade, but probably not enough to accomplish the proper Kukri shape. So I'm going to go ahead and put more of a bend about the middle of the blade so that we can make sure that we have that recurve shape to it when we're done. Now I can start forging the bevel in here, and that's simply a matter of working my way evenly up and try to forge on both sides. This isn't particularly necessary because you can forge on one side and then knock it back to center, but in this case I'm more or less forging on both sides as evenly as possible. In hindsight, I wouldn't have tapered the tip of the blade down quite as much because I felt like I had to try and spread the stock out to gain the width that I wanted more than I would have had to, but it worked out fine. So I need to put some additional counterbend into it because as I'm forging the bevel, it's spreading out too much and straightening the blade too much. So this is an effective method of doing that without dinging up the existing forged dimensions or profile that you have at the time. Continuing to forge the bevel here, evening things up, getting a little more width on the front end of the blade. And we'll go ahead and stamp in the Fire Creek Forge logo. At this point, the forging process is almost completely finished. I'm just doing some straightening and some fine-tuning on the bevel. Following the forging process, I can clean up the profile a little bit from the little bumps and bits here and there prior to the heat treating process. After I got the profile cleaned up on the grinder, I found that the angle of the tang as the blade went into the handle here is not quite what I wanted. It wouldn't have necessarily been technically incorrect, as I have seen kukris that tend to have a curve that continues through the handle, but it wasn't quite what I was trying to do on this particular project. So I fixed it, and now we can go ahead and normalize the blades. First step in the heat treating process here to even everything up in the internal structure of the steel. Following the normalizing process, I did a subcritical anneal for a couple of reasons. First, so that the steel will be soft enough to drill handle bolt holes through, and secondly, to further prep the steel for hardening down the road. Once the subcritical anneal is complete and the handle bolt holes were drilled, I performed a grain refinement cycle and then rough ground the blades. The reason I rough ground the blades is because I don't like grinding hardened steel too much, and even though I would have been comfortable heat treating these blades at these dimensions, the less hardened steel I have to grind after the fact, the better. Having quenched the steel and then removed it from the quench prior to full cooling, I'm able to tweak it a little bit as it cools down and remove a couple of minor warps to the steel. Before I put it in for the temper, I want to make sure that it's cooled down to room temperature, and so while it's still maybe a couple of hundred degrees and air cooled to that point, I'm going to cool it down the rest of the way in some water. Now that we've run the blade through a couple of tempering cycles to regain some toughness in the steel and make a very durable blade, we can go ahead and finish grind it. Due to the compound curve nature of this design, it's a little bit more difficult to grind, I found, than your typical blade project. And I think this is why some bladesmiths I've seen will use a draw filing technique to complete the shaping process on a blade like this. However, I was able to use the grinder to complete this, partly by using one edge or the other, depending on which direction I was grinding the blade, to navigate the compound curve nature of this blade. Once we have the blade ground almost to finished dimensions, I want to make sure that there's no decarburized steel on what is going to be our edge, and I also want a consistent thickness as I prepare to do the final grinding and make a convex bevel on the cutting edge of this tool. The convex bevel is going to be very important to the performance and durability of this blade. It is perhaps the best compromise between strength and cutting clearance when it comes to a heavy use blade. At this point, we can go ahead and strop the edge on the buffing wheel to get a razor sharp blade and move into the testing phase. As I mentioned earlier, the purpose of this blade is a field or bushcraft knife, and I have a piece of mulberry branch here. It is still green, which is probably going to be the majority of type of woods that someone's going to use this for. But the ease in which it lopped off these smaller branches was quite amazing. I then switched to what I believe is magnolia, but it's a much harder denser wood for sure, and the blade continued to perform quite nicely. In fact, the only drawback to this testing phase was the fact that the tang tended to dig into your fingers since there was no handle scales attached at this point. So I've got about 1.5 inches, maybe 1 3/4 piece of wood here, and we'll go ahead and see how quickly we can chop through this on a chopping block. And this demonstrates the inherent design of the Kukri that provides that amazing chopping power. You can see how finely grained that wood is. I wanted to perform a 2x4 chop test, and so after cutting some limbs as shown here, I went ahead and made sure it was still shaving sharp and then chopped through the 2x4 twice. Unfortunately, I wasn't aware of exactly where I was chopping on the Kukri, and so I tested the shaving ability not quite in the right spot on the blade. I'm still confident it would have done just fine. So now to move on to some cutting clearance tests here, and you can see that I was almost able to get through the pumpkin, but my mounting method there was not very good and it pulled out. But you can see here that the slicing ability of the Kukri here does quite well. Testing complete and the hand sanding fairy having made a visit, we can go ahead and put a nice dark acid etch on this blade. Altogether, I think I had it in the etch about 2.5 hours and cleaned the oxide off several times during that process. I'm going to use bloodwood for the handle scales here, partly because I think it'll look nice with a dark blade contrast, and also because I have it in some pretty thick stock, about 3/4 inch I believe, which is what I need to complete the bell shape on the handle. After flattening the handle scales a little bit and drilling the holes, I'll need to countersink each hole, and the front end is going to be countersunk more than the back end since that portion of the handle will be narrower. Then we can go ahead and clean up and finish the front end of the scales. I noticed that on most Kukris there is no chamfer on the front of the handle scales, assuming it's a full tang construction, and so I left them pretty square, just like the ones that I saw in other historical or older pictures. Once the epoxy is cured, we can go ahead and shape the handle and remove a bunch of the material with a 36 grit aluminum oxide belt, which works well for this kind of thing. Follow that with some hand sanding to finish the surface of the bloodwood, and then we can go ahead and apply some Danish oil with a walnut stained color to it to protect and preserve the wood, and it still leaves a nice red color. Well, this has been an interesting project, and I'm going to show you some pictures of the finished Kukri in just a second here. But it's easy to see why the Kukri has been used by various militaries and, of course, civilians in various parts of the world for generations. It's a very effective tool and, of course, I'm sure, weapon as well. If you've enjoyed this video and found it useful or informative, just know that you can support the channel and help me continue to bring you content like this, as well as other even cooler projects in the future, simply by liking, subscribing, hitting that notifications bell, leaving a comment. All of this stuff helps to grow the channel, so I appreciate the support. As always, thanks for watching, and we will see you on the next video.